The Iron Jaws garage sat at the edge of Harlow, Nevada, where the last stretch of Route 9 crumbled into gravel, and the nearest streetlight had been out since the previous winter. Nobody had reported it. Nobody came out this way unless they meant to. The building looked like it had absorbed decades of punishment and decided to keep standing out of stubbornness. Corrugated metal walls patched in 3 different places with mismatched sheets that had rusted to slightly different shades of orange and brown. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, Iron Jaws MC, members only. In letters that had been touched up so many times the paint had built up into ridges you could feel with your fingertips. The parking lot was oil-stained asphalt giving way to hard desert dirt, and 3 motorcycles sat outside, even in October, because the men who rode them preferred to keep their bikes visible, the way some people prefer to sleep with the lights on. Inside, the air was thick, motor oil cigarette smoke, and the particular scent of old coffee that had been sitting on a burner since morning, bitter and slightly scorched. The kind of coffee nobody threw out because throwing it out would require acknowledging that someone had made it and then failed to drink it, and that was a whole conversation nobody wanted to have. The overhead fluorescents buzzed. One of them flickered every 45 seconds, with a reliability that had become so predictable, the crew no longer noticed it. 3 bikes were up on lifts, their engines half disassembled parts laid out on workbenches with the particular reverence of a surgery in progress. Russ Hale stood at the paint station near the back wall, a custom airbrush in one hand studying the fuel tank clamped in front of him. He'd been working on this piece for 6 days, a client out of Phoenix who wanted something he called subtle but aggressive, which Russ had interpreted as a deep gunmetal base with flamework that only revealed itself fully in direct sunlight. The client didn't know yet that Russ had added a ghost image of a hawk mid-dive that appeared when the light hit at exactly the right angle. He would find out when he picked up the tank and either love it or demand a redo, and either way, Russ would have made the piece he intended to make. Donovan Bale was leaning against the far toolbox, a beer in hand, even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon, because Donovan's relationship with time was flexible on days when nothing was on fire. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of forearms that came from 30 years of wrenching rather than a gym, and he had the habit of going very still when he was thinking hard about something which made him look either calm or dangerous depending on whether you knew him. Cal Pruitt, the youngest member at 26, was on his back under a Road King, his boots the only part of him visible from across the room, tapping an irregular rhythm against the concrete as he worked. He'd been patched in 14 months ago and was still in the phase where he worked harder than anyone else in the room to prove he belonged. And in the corner near the space heater, where the warmth collected and made the corner feel like a different room from the rest of the garage, sat Gideon Marsh, 63 years old, the last founding member still breathing. He had a face that had been broken and reset and broken again, not dramatically but gradually, the way a piece of iron changes shape under years of moderate stress. His hair was silver white and cropped close. His hands resting on a stack of invoices were the most expressive thing about him. Scarred across the knuckles, missing the last joint of the ring finger on his left hand, but steady in a way that spoke of a man who had learned to be still when everything around him moved. He was reading an invoice from a parts supplier in Reno and making notes in the margins with a mechanical pencil when the door opened. Nobody announced it. The door just opened, and the girl was there. She stood in the frame for a moment, one hand still on the door, the other holding the strap of a backpack that had clearly traveled hard. She was small, not unusually so for 14, but the kind of small that came partly from frame and partly from not having eaten enough consistently for long enough that the body had learned to run lean. Her jacket was a men's medium olive drab, the sleeves rolled back twice to keep her hands free. Her hair was dark, pulled into a ponytail that had started the day neat and lost the argument with wind and motion. Her sneakers were worn at the toes, the left one with a small tear near the sole that had been repaired with what looked like electrical tape. She stood there and looked at the room the way someone looks at a place they've been imagining for a long time, checking the reality against the picture they'd built in their head, finding the differences. Russ was the first one to actually stop and look at her. He set down the airbrush. He had a daughter. The instinct was automatic. "Hey," he said, not unkind, just a fact. "You lost." The girl's eyes moved to him. She shook her head once, and then she took a step aside and let the door swing shut behind her. The room's ambient noise shifted. Conversations dropped to lower registers. Cal's boots stopped tapping. Donovan straightened up from the toolbox. We don't do tours, Donovan said. Matter of fact, no edge in it yet. She walked to the nearest workbench, unshouldered her backpack, and set it down with the practiced movement of someone who had done that motion 10,000 times. She looked around the room, not nervously, but cataloging, taking inventory of faces, positions, the layout of exits. It was a particular kind of looking that Gideon recognized from across the garage. He'd seen it before in people who'd spent time in situations where knowing the room was not a habit, but a necessity. I can paint, she said. Her voice was quiet and steady, the kind of steady that came not from confidence, but from the decision to project it regardless of how you felt underneath. Bikes, helmets, whatever you need, I'll work for tips. A beat of silence. Then someone laughed. Not cruelly surprised laughter, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether it's appropriate. Donovan covered it with a cough. Even Gideon felt the corner of his mouth move. A teenage girl walking into a garage full of men who'd been riding since before she was born, offering to paint custom work for tips. It was absurd in the specific way that things which are also sincere tend to be absurd. Russ recovered first. He had the particular equilibrium of a man who'd been thrown off balance so many times he'd stopped being surprised by it. Yeah, he said, you got a portfolio. Something to show. She didn't answer right away. She reached into her jacket pocket, the inside pocket, not the outer one, the kind of pocket you use for things you don't want to lose, and pulled out something folded. A napkin. Paper, not cloth, slightly wrinkled, stained in the upper right corner with what might have been coffee or might have been machine grease. She handled it like it was fragile. She unfolded it with both hands, careful and deliberate, and slid it across the workbench toward Russ. He leaned in, his expression changed. The drawing on the napkin had been made with a ballpoint pen, cheap, probably a gas station pen, but the execution was not cheap at all. The image showed a custom emblem, a jagged jawbone rendered in profile, curved and slightly abstract, wrapped around a coiled serpent. From the base of the design, stylized flames curled upward, detailed enough that you could see individual tongues of fire. Inside the serpent's coil, two initials, EM. Below the design, a date. Russ recognized the style before he recognized the emblem. He had worked alongside Eli Merritt for 4 years. He knew the way the man's hand moved, the particular weight he gave to curves, the way he built shadow into a drawing, not by shading uniformly, but by carving absence, leaving bright lines inside dark areas, creating the illusion of light from within. He knew that hand. He was looking at it right now on a napkin held by a 14-year-old girl who had walked in off the street. He looked up at her. She was watching him. Where did you get this? He asked. My brother drew it. Across the room, Gideon Marsh stood up. He didn't stand quickly. He wasn't a man who moved quickly anymore. But he stood with a kind of intention that made everyone in the room look over. Because Gideon Marsh sitting down and Gideon Marsh standing up were two categorically different states of being, and when one became the other, it meant something. He crossed the garage in 6 strides. He picked up the napkin from the bench and held it at reading distance, and the room watched the color change in his face. His jaw tightened. His hands, those steady, deliberate hands, were shaking. Where did you get this? He said. Not a question, a demand. I told you, she said. My brother. Your brother, his voice was a stone dropped in still water. Eli Merritt. The name landed in the room like a change in air pressure. Not loud, just present, and then everything around it was different. Donovan set his beer down on the toolbox. It clicked against the metal. Russ stepped back from the workbench. Cal rolled out from under the Road King and sat up on the concrete, wiping his hands on a rag, confused, but reading the room well enough to know that sitting up was correct. Eli. Hollow. Merritt. The name moved through the room the way the names of the dead move, slowly touching everything. Eli Hollow Merritt had been one of the original 4 Iron Jaws. A rider with reflexes like water finding a path, who could read a road the way other men read text intuitively and fast. A storyteller who could hold a room of drunk men silent for 20 minutes with nothing but the right words in the right order. And a painter, custom work so distinctive that bikes Eli had touched were still being referenced. Still being shown as examples of what was possible 8 years after he'd gone down on a rain-slicked stretch of highway outside of Kingman, Arizona. Solo ride. Nobody with him. He'd hit a patch of oil near an on-ramp and gone down hard, and by the time the first car stopped, Eli Merritt was already gone. The club had buried him with full honors. They had mourned him the way men like them mourned quietly and incompletely, carrying pieces of it for years. They had not erased him. His name was on the wall inside, a framed photograph behind the register, his first custom piece still hanging near the paint station. Nobody had ever mentioned a sister. Gideon's jaw was working. He set the napkin down on the bench carefully as if it might disintegrate. Hollow never talked about family, he said. He kept things separate, the girl said. He said the club was important. He said I was important. He didn't want those things to touch. She paused. But he also said that if I ever needed help, real help, the kind that matters, I should find you. He said you'd know what to do. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He was looking for something specific, and he was finding it, and that was making him more unsettled rather than less. What's your name? He asked. Sloan. Sloan Merritt. Yes. How old are you? 14. Russ and Donovan exchanged a look. Gideon didn't move his eyes from the girl. And what exactly do you need help with, Sloan? She held his gaze. Work, she said. I need work. That's all. It was not all. Every man in the room could hear what was under the words, the particular compression of a story being held back because the situation didn't yet feel safe enough to release it. Gideon had heard that particular silence in 100 different voices over 63 years. He knew what it meant, and he knew that pushing too hard too fast would close it off entirely. He looked at Russ. Russ looked at the napkin, then at Sloan, then back at Gideon. All right, Gideon said finally. You want to paint. Show me what Hollow taught you. Russ pulled a stripped fuel tank down from the shelf behind his station, a salvage piece, nothing on it, currently no risk. He set it on the bench and laid out brushes, paints, a set of airbrush nozzles in a leather roll. 1 hour, he said. No stencils, no tracing, just what you've got. Sloan looked at the tank. She looked at the materials. She rolled her left sleeve back slightly further and picked up a brush. Nobody left the room. They drifted back to their tasks in the way people do when they're pretending not to watch something. Donovan picked up his beer. Cal went back under the Road King. Russ moved to a secondary bench and started cleaning an airbrush head he'd already cleaned that morning. But attention stayed on Sloan. She didn't sketch first. She didn't measure or mark. She started painting the way certain people start talking, in the middle from the inside out, because the whole shape of the thing was already present inside her, and the act of beginning was just the act of letting it emerge. Her hands moved fast but precise. She built layers the way Eli had built them, working transparent over opaque building depth, before breath letting each pass dry, just barely before laying the next. The design that emerged was not a copy of the napkin. It was related to it. It had the same bones, the jawbone, the serpent, the flamework, but it was alive in its own way. Younger, more aggressive, the lines slightly sharper, the shading denser in the shadows, and more explosive at the highlights. At 20 minutes, Donovan put down his beer and came to stand behind her. He watched for a while and then went to lean against the wall, arms crossed, still watching. He had seen good custom paintwork many times. He had a decent eye for it. What he was watching now was not in the category of good custom paintwork the way he understood that category. It was something else. Something that didn't announce itself, but that you felt in the back of the skull, the way you feel a change in weather before the sky does anything visible. At 35 minutes, Cal gave up the pretense, entirely rolled out from under the bike, and sat on a stool nearby with his elbows on his knees. He was 26 and had been riding since he was 17 and had been patched into the Iron Jaws 14 months ago, and had never met Eli Merritt, knew him only from a photograph on a wall and from the way the older members sometimes went quiet when his name came up. But he was watching the tank and watching the girl's hands and understanding with the clarity of the young that he was seeing something that mattered. At 50 minutes, Russ had not touched the airbrush he'd been pretending to clean. He had set it down sometime around the 40-minute mark and had simply been watching since then, and there was something happening in his face that he would have been embarrassed to describe. He had been painting custom bikes for 19 years. He had worked with talented people. He had seen the kind of work that made other painters look at their own hands and wonder what the point was. And he had worked alongside Eli Merritt for 4 years and had learned things from him that he couldn't have learned anywhere else. He was looking at the girl's work now and feeling something he hadn't expected to feel, which was gratitude. Gratitude that Eli had passed it down, that the thing Eli understood about painting hadn't died with him, that it was alive in the hands of his 14-year-old sister standing in their garage in the desert. At 60 minutes, Sloan set down the brush and stepped back. The tank was extraordinary. Gideon had seen custom paintwork for 40 years. He knew the difference between technical proficiency and something alive. This was alive. The iron jaw motif wrapped around the body of the tank with the structural logic of something grown rather than placed. The serpent in the center seemed coiled against the metal. The flames licked the edges with a particular kind of controlled ferocity that was impossible to fake. You either felt it or you didn't, and Sloan Merritt felt it absolutely. And the style was undeniable. It was Hollow's hand, not imitation inheritance. The same way a voice carries across generations, not in the specific words, but in the particular timbre underneath them. Gideon stepped forward. He put two fingers along the edge of the design, not touching the painted surface, just tracing the air above it. He taught you this, he said. Every weekend, she said, for 3 years before she stopped, before the accident. Gideon straightened up. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. You're staying, he said. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact that had just become true. Sloan Merritt stayed. Not officially, there was no official about it. Gideon didn't say the words, and Sloan didn't ask for them. But when the garage locked up that night, she was still inside, and when Russ quietly put a blanket and a wrapped sandwich on the cot in the back office, she took it. She curled up and went to sleep with the particular speed of someone who has learned to rest in windows, because windows don't stay open long. Gideon sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going home, staring at nothing. The engine was off, and the Nevada cold came through the windows, but he didn't start it again. He sat with the napkin in his mind, not the physical object, which was back inside, but the image on it, the emblem, the initials, the date that meant something specific to a specific group of men who had gathered on a specific night and made something that lasted. Eli had been 24 when he'd drawn that emblem. He'd been sitting at a bar in Reno on a Tuesday afternoon when the idea came to him, and he'd borrowed a pen from the bartender and drawn it on a cocktail napkin in 15 minutes, and then he'd brought it to Gideon and said, "This is what we are." Gideon had looked at it for a long time and then said, "Yeah, it is." They'd gone from there. Eli had kept a copy. Of course he had. And somehow through the years and the custody battle and the foster homes and 6 weeks of a 14-year-old girl moving through Nevada by herself, the copy had survived. She'd kept it the way you keep the last thing someone gave you. Gideon finally started the car. He drove home through the empty streets of Harlow, past the gas station and the diner and the hardware store and the lot where the old drive-in theater used to be, and he thought about the things he should have known and hadn't. He thought about Eli never mentioning a sister. He thought about the ways men carried things alone because they believed that was the responsible way to carry them, and how often that belief was wrong. He thought about a 10-year-old girl sitting in a foster home waiting for her brother to come through. He parked in his driveway and sat there for another few minutes in the dark before going inside. The next morning, she was already awake when Donovan arrived at 7. She was sitting in the back office with her backpack open and a battered notebook on her knees drawing. The notebook was dense pages so full of sketches that they had begun to bulge outward at the edges. She closed it when she heard him come in, but not fast enough to hide that she'd been deep in it. Donovan leaned against the doorframe and looked at her. He had a coffee in each hand, habit he always made two, and he held one out toward her. She took it. "You got people looking for you?" he asked. She looked at the coffee instead of at him. "Probably. That going to be a problem for us?" She thought about it. "I don't know yet." Donovan took a sip of his own coffee. He had 3 kids. His oldest was 17, close enough that he could do the math and feel the weight of it. "Sloan," he said, "we can't harbor a runaway. You understand that. We're not some kind of underground railroad." "I'm not asking you to hide me," she said. "I'm asking for work. Work requires documentation, age verification. We're a legitimate business." "Sloan Merritt, 14, and I don't have documentation anymore." Donovan studied her. "Where'd you come from?" She closed the notebook completely, both hands flat on the cover. "A group home, Fairfield County. They just let you walk out." "They didn't let me do anything." The story came out in pieces over the next 3 days, not all at once, not to any one person, but the way debris surfaces after a shipwreck, piece by piece in the order the current decides. Nora Voss was the one who assembled most of it. Nora handled the club's books and managed its legitimate paperwork, licensing, insurance, tax filings, the meticulous infrastructure that kept the Iron Jaws operating as a business rather than just a gathering. She was 41, precise and unhurried, and she had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like interrogations, because she never seemed to need the answers she asked out of what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and that made it easier to answer honestly. She brought Sloan food one evening, a proper meal, not a sandwich, and sat across from her in the back office and talked about irrelevant things for 20 minutes. The desert at night, the way the temperature dropped so fast you could feel the heat being pulled upward like it had somewhere to be. The oddness of Nevada light in autumn, thin and direct, and somehow both bright and cold at once. Sloan filled the silence. She didn't decide to. She just did the way you do when someone creates a space that's genuinely comfortable and makes the space outside of it feel lonelier by comparison. She'd been in foster care since Eli died. She was 11 then. The first home was functional, not warm, but functional. The couple who ran it were in their 50s, tired in the specific way of people who had been doing the same difficult thing for a long time and had stopped asking whether it was working. They fed her. They kept the house at a reasonable temperature. They did not throw anything away. She had lived there for 8 months, and the clearest memory she had of that time was the sound of a television in the next room. Every evening, the same 3 shows, the same volume, the reliable rhythm of it. The second home was a family with 2 biological children, ages 8 and 10. The mother meant well in the way people mean well when they have decided in advance what a thing will be and then discover the thing is more complicated than the decision. She wanted Sloan to be healable. She had ideas about what healing looked like. When Sloan's version of healing didn't match the ideas, when it was quieter, less demonstrative, conducted mostly through drawing and not through the conversations the mother had imagined, the mother grew anxious and then frustrated. And then she filed a report with the caseworker saying Sloan was withdrawn and not responding to family integration, and 6 weeks later, Sloan was moved again. The third was the group home, which operated under a set of rules that had the structure of procedure and the texture of cruelty. Personal items were privileges, behavior was managed through denial. She'd mentioned Eli during her intake assessment, mentioned her brother, the one who'd raised her through most of her conscious memory, who'd taught her to paint and told her about the stars over the Nevada desert, and made her breakfast on Saturday mornings and read to her when she was sick and been for 11 years, the single fixed point in her life, and the staff had written excessive attachment to deceased sibling monitor for dependency on grief narrative in her file, which she'd found later and which had told her everything she needed to know about what kind of place she was in. When she asked to keep his dog tags, they said no. Personal items were a privilege to be earned. The tags went into a box. The box went into storage. She was told she could apply to access them in 90 days if her behavior record was satisfactory. She found the sketchbook in her room, the one Eli had given her 2 Christmases before his accident, the one where he'd sketched the emblem she now carried on the napkin, the one with pages of his notes on technique and theory and the particular philosophy of painting that he'd developed over years and tried to pass down in the months before he died, as if some part of him had known he wouldn't have time to do it more slowly. The notes were dense and sometimes technical and sometimes philosophical and occasionally funny because Eli couldn't write anything without putting himself in it. Margin notes about specific colors, arguments with himself about the difference between style and voice, a small drawing of a coyote in the bottom corner of page 14 that had nothing to do with anything but that Sloan had studied so many times she could redraw it from memory. A supervisor found it, flipped through it, set it in the trash. It wasn't confiscated. It wasn't put in storage. It was thrown away. Sloan waited until lights out, walked to the dumpster behind the facility, and retrieved it. The night was cold, a Nevada October that bit through her thin jacket, and she'd crouched beside the dumpster in the dark and held the sketchbook against her chest for a moment before she looked at it to confirm it was intact. It was. She went back inside, packed her backpack, what would fit, what mattered, the dog tags she'd found a way to access 3 weeks earlier and had kept hidden since, and left. That had been 6 weeks before she walked into the Iron Jaws garage. 6 weeks of bus stations and fast food bathrooms and odd jobs paid in cash, staying just ahead of whatever systems were trying to pull a or not about navigating the particular bureaucracy of homelessness, which is everywhere and exhausting and designed in ways that make it difficult to escape once you're in it. She'd slept in a bus station in Barstow for 4 nights, in the corner near the vending machines, where the light was brightest and the foot traffic was enough to make her invisible. She'd washed dishes for 2 days at a diner in Beatty for $12 cash and a meal, which was the best deal she'd gotten in 6 weeks. She'd spent one night in a church shelter in Tonopah that was warm and clean, and where the intake volunteer had asked too many questions about her family, and she'd left before sunrise because the questions meant paperwork, and paperwork meant the system would know where she'd been. She kept moving west and then north, the direction Eli had always associated with home, and she kept the napkin in the inside pocket of her jacket and checked it sometimes in the middle of the night, in the way you check on something precious to confirm it's still there, that the whole trajectory of your motion is still anchored to something real. Harlow had taken her 11 days to reach from Beatty, traveling by bus and on foot, and twice by accepting rides from people who were clearly harmless and going roughly the right direction. She'd known the garage was at the edge of town on Route 9 because Eli had mentioned it once, not the address, just the landmark, the old drive-in theater lot. The garage past it on the right, you can see the sign from the road. She'd walked the last 2 miles from the bus stop on a morning when the temperature was 40 degrees and the wind was coming down from the north. And when she'd seen the sign, she'd stopped and looked at it for a long time before she went in. She had not expected them to be kind. She had expected them to be her only option. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When Sloan finished, Nora was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your brother never told us about you." "No," Sloan said. "Do you know why?" Sloan thought about it. "He was protecting me. He always thought the club came with weight, complications. He loved it, but he knew what it looked like from outside, and he didn't want that to touch my life until he could shape how it happened, until he could be there to explain it." She paused. "He was going to get me out of the foster system. He told me, he said he was working on it." Nora's expression didn't change, but she made a note in her head. If Eli Merritt had been trying to secure custody of his sister, there would be paperwork. Legal proceedings left trails, and if there was a trail, it was worth following. She started that night. The county family court records were not immediately accessible to a civilian, but Nora had developed over many years of managing the club's affairs a particular skill at locating information that was technically public, but practically obscured. She knew which databases talked to each other and which ones didn't. She knew how to interpret partial records. She knew that absence was itself a form of data. She found the filing on the third night. It was indexed under Eli Merritt's name, dated 8 months before his accident, a formal custody petition filed with the court on behalf of Sloan Merritt, then age 10. The petition cited Eli as the sole surviving family member and primary relational figure in the child's life. It requested termination of current foster arrangement and transfer of guardianship. The petition had been denied. The denial was 3 pages dense with procedural language, but the core of it was straightforward. The evaluator had determined that Eli Merritt's lifestyle and associations made him unsuitable as a custodial parent. The language used was clinical, but the meaning was plain. The iron jaws were considered a liability. Eli's membership in the club was in the court's assessment incompatible with a stable home environment. At the bottom of the denial, a reference "See attached incident report sealed per judicial order." Nora could not access the sealed report, but the summary attached to the denial mentioned something that made her sit forward in her chair: allegations of institutional negligence and potential misconduct at current placement site under review. The allegations had been made, they had been noted, and then apparently they had been set aside. She printed everything she had and brought it to Gideon the following morning. He read the documents at his desk by the space heater, the garage warming up around him as the crew arrived one by one. He read them twice slowly with the particular attention he gave to things that had weight, not speed reading for information, but reading for understanding, the way you read something when you need to know what it means rather than just what it says. The custody petition first. Eli's handwriting on the attached letter, he recognized it, the same hand that had signed work orders and left notes on invoices, and once written 6 pages of thoughts about the philosophy of custom paintwork that had been circulating in the club's files for years. The petition itself was formal and careful and legally correct, the kind of document you produce when you've done the research and you're taking it seriously. Eli had not filed this casually. He'd prepared. Then the denial. He read the specific language 3 times. Association with the Iron Jaws Motorcycle Club creates an environment that is, he stopped. Read it again. Set it down. He sat with it for a while. Then the summary with the sealed incident report. Allegations of institutional negligence and potential misconduct at current placement site. The allegations had been noted and set aside. He read that twice too. When he finished, he set the papers down and put both hands flat on the desk and stared at the middle distance for a long time. Outside the dirty window, Sloan was visible at the paint bay headphones and working. She'd arrived before any of the crew again. She was always there before anyone else, as if she was afraid that if she arrived last, the arrangement might not still be in place. He tried, he said. His voice was rough, the way a man's voice gets when he's holding something down by force. The court shut him out because of us, Nora said. Because of the association. Gideon was quiet for a long time. He could have left us on end, he said finally. If the association was the problem, he could have left the club, got his patch pulled, walked away. People have done it. He didn't, Nora said. No, Gideon said. He didn't. He was quiet again. Why didn't he come to us if the petition was denied because of us? Why didn't he tell us we could have? He stopped. We would have done something. I think he was embarrassed, Nora said carefully, or he thought it was something he needed to solve himself, or he didn't want to put the club in the position of choosing between their status and his sister. Gideon thought about that, Eli not wanting to make it a choice, Eli carrying the whole weight because he didn't want anyone else to have to. He spent the last 8 months of his life trying to get her out, Nora said, and the system told him he was the problem. And then he died, Gideon said, and she had nobody. She's been nobody's problem for 3 years, Nora said, except her own. Gideon stood. He looked through the dirty window toward the paint bay where Sloan was already working headphones and adding detail to a helmet a client had brought in. Her posture when she painted was particular, slightly forward weight on the front foot, the stillness of deep concentration that he recognized from watching her brother work in this same space 8 years ago. We're not sending her back, Gideon said. I know, Nora said. That might not be as simple as we want it to be. It won't be simple at all, Nora said, but I think we need to understand what we're actually dealing with before we decide how to fight it. He nodded. He folded the documents carefully and set them in the inside pocket of his jacket where he kept things he needed to keep. He would carry them there for the next several days, and when he finally gave them to Adele, the folds would be worn soft from handling. Word had begun to spread in the local riding community. Bikes that had come back from the Iron Jaws garage were showing paintwork that people were talking about. A man named Briggs, who ran a shop in Fernley, came in personally to see the tank Sloan had done on the first day still sitting on a shelf because the owner hadn't picked it up yet. Briggs stood in front of it for a long time and then turned to Russ and said, "That's Hollow's hand." "Related," Russ said. Briggs looked at Sloan, who was working on a new piece with her back to them. She'd started on a fuel tank for a regular client, a Harlow man who rode a '09 Street Glide and who had been waiting 6 months for Russ to have time for the custom work he wanted. She was doing the preliminary coats, the foundational layers, building the ground that everything else would go on top of. It was technically the least interesting part of the work, but she was doing it with the same focused attention she brought to everything because she understood that the ground was where pieces failed. You could have the best hand in the room and produce garbage if you built it on a weak base. "That's a real thing," Briggs said quietly. "That's not an accident." He came back 3 days later with a man named Okafor who had a customization shop in Sparks 40 minutes north. Okafor watched Sloan work for 20 minutes without saying anything, and then he said something to Russ in a low voice, and Russ said something back, and Okafor nodded and left his card on the bench. A week later, a new client arrived from Sparks, a referral, the first of several. She was starting to build something. She didn't fully understand yet what she was building, but it was real. Gideon watched all of it from the corner near the space heater. He watched people come in and look at the work and look at the girl and leave with an expression that he recognized, the expression of having encountered something they hadn't expected, something that had reorganized their understanding of what was possible. He had seen that expression on people's faces when they watched Eli work in the years before the accident. It was not common. It was the specific reaction to a specific kind of talent That was also a kind of calling. The rare case where what someone was built for and what they did were exactly the same thing. The attention made Donovan nervous. Every person who came through the garage was a variable. He mentioned it at a brief meeting in the back office, just him, Gideon, Nora, and Cal. The more people who know she's here, Donovan said, the more exposure we have. She needs to be known, Gideon said. She needs roots. The more people who can speak to her, being here, being stable, working, the better our case. Our case isn't built yet, Donovan said. It's being built, Nora said. She had a folder in front of her physical documents, printed copies of everything organized with the thoroughness she brought to all the club's records. Adele Forsyth is reviewing everything I compiled. She's moving fast. How fast? Donovan asked. She wants to file an emergency petition for guardianship before anyone files anything formal against us. If we're already in the system as petitioners, it changes the dynamic completely. And if someone files first, then we're responding instead of initiating, Nora said, which is a worse position. So we move now. Donovan exhaled. He looked at Gideon. You're ready for the background checks. Everything they are going to find. Gideon looked back at him steadily. I have done things in my life I'm not proud of. None of it is a secret and none of it endangered a child. Let them look. Donovan was quiet for a moment. This club has worked hard to stay legitimate. 15 years of clean operations. If this goes sideways, Donovan, Gideon said, Eli Merritt spent 8 months trying to save her, and the system stopped him because of this club, because of our name, our history. If we walk away from her now, what was any of it for? The silence stretched. I'm not walking away, Donovan said finally. I'm just naming the risk. Named, Gideon said, and noted and accepted. It was Cal who found the other thread, and he found it by accident. He'd been pulling old digital files. The club kept a server with archived records, correspondence, maintenance logs, anything that had been scanned or typed in the past decade, because Nora had asked him to look for any documents related to Eli's custody case. He was methodical about it, going folder by folder, and in a subfolder marked MISC correspondence. 2016, he found a chain of emails that didn't belong there. They were addressed to a private investigator based out of Las Vegas. The investigator's name was not important. What was important was who had hired him. The hiring party had been careful. Most references to them were redacted or coded, but in one email deep in the chain where someone had been less careful than usual, a name slipped through. Raymond Ventry. Cal didn't know the name. He searched it in the club's records and found nothing. He brought it to Nora. Nora went very still when she read it. Ventry, she said. You know him. I know of him, she said. He ran with the Steel Chains, a rival club years back, before you were patched. What happened to them? They fell apart, leadership issues, legal trouble. The club dissolved around 2017. She set down the printout. Ventry's brother was riding with them when the club was still active. His name was Dean. What happened to Dean? Nora was quiet for a moment, choosing words. He died in a crash, same night as Eli, different highway about an hour apart. The official report called them separate incidents, unrelated accidents on different roads. Cal was quiet for a moment, processing. But the Steel Chains thought differently. They thought Eli had run his brother off the road, Nora said, during some kind of confrontation earlier that evening. There was no evidence for it. Gideon was with Eli most of that night, said they rode back together from a run up north separated about an hour from home, said Eli hit oil on the on-ramp near Kingman and went down, that was all. And Dean Ventry's crash. An hour later, miles away, the investigators found nothing connecting the two events. It was ruled coincidental. She tapped the printout with one finger. But Raymond Ventry didn't believe it. He spent years trying to find something he could use against the iron jaws, against Eli specifically. And when Eli was already gone, she stopped. Cal finished the thought. He went after the sister. Nora looked at the email chain again. The inquiry had been active recently. The investigator had been asking questions at shelters and bus stations in a 30-mile radius. Sloan had been moving fast, but she hadn't been moving in random directions. She'd been moving toward the garage, following the single piece of information Eli had given her. And in doing so, she'd been moving towards something she hadn't known was hunting her. He's been following her, Cal said. He's been herding her, Nora said, back into the system, into a placement where he has connections. He doesn't need to touch her. He just needs her in the right building. She stood. We need to bring this to Gideon tonight. The club gathered in the back room that evening, door closed, voices kept low. The usual ambient noise of the garage continuing outside, so nothing from the exterior would change, and alert Sloane, who was working near the paint station with her headphones in. Nora laid out what she and Cal had found. She presented it clearly, and in sequence the custody petition, the denial, the sealed incident report, the Ventry connection, the private investigator currently operating in the area. The room was quiet when she finished. Donovan was the first to speak. So it's not just a runaway situation. Someone is actively hunting her. And using the system to do it, Nora said. He doesn't need to abduct her. He just needs her back in a placement where he has reach, a facility he has connections to, something that can be made worse than where she came from. Russ had been staring at the floor. He looked up. She's 14 years old, and she walked in here because her dead brother told her to. And there's a grown man spending money to make sure she ends up somewhere terrible. Nobody responded. There was nothing useful to say to that. It was just the truth set in the room. What's our play? Russ asked. We get ahead of it legally, Gideon said. We build a case before Ventry can file anything. We document everything that shows she's stable here, that she's been cared for, that she's thriving. And we get a lawyer, Donovan said. I know someone. Family law handles custody placements. Adele Forsyth. She's sharp, and she doesn't waste time. Call her, Gideon said. Donovan nodded. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the door, then stopped and looked back into the room. Through the small window in the door, visible at an angle, was the paint bay. Sloane was still working, oblivious to the conversation happening 20 feet away, her brush moving in the steady, precise rhythm that was becoming as recognizable to all of them as a voice. On the wall behind her, a new piece had been started. It was large. She'd asked Gideon 2 days ago if she could use the far wall, and he'd said yes without asking why. What she was building was becoming visible now, a mural wide and dense, showing a group of riders on an open road. The figures were still rough, the bikes more detailed than the people, but the composition was clear, and the ambition behind it unmistakable. At the center of the group, at the head of the formation, was a rider whose posture and bike Gideon had recognized immediately. Eli Merritt, rendered from Sloane's memory, was leading the Iron Jaws home. Behind him, at the edge of the composition, barely sketched, barely present, a smaller figure on a bike made of light pencil lines. Not finished, not yet real, still becoming. Donovan looked at it for a moment, then stepped outside to make the call. 3 days later, Gideon went looking for Sloane. He found her where he expected to, standing in front of the mural in the late afternoon, the garage mostly empty, the light coming through the high windows at a low angle and turning everything amber and warm. She was studying the piece the way a writer reads something they're working on, not for pleasure, but to understand what's still missing. A brush in her right hand, not raised, just held the way you hold something when you're thinking and not yet doing. The mural had grown considerably in 3 days. The riders were more defined now. He recognized Russ in the way one figure leaned forward over the tank, that particular aggressive posture, weight forward, like the bike was an argument he was winning. He recognized Donovan in the breadth of the shoulders on another figure, the way the arms sat at rest, folded slightly, guarded the specific body language of a man who was present but maintained perimeter. Cal thinner slightly, apart from the main group watching the road ahead rather than the riders around him. Even Nora was there on the far left edge, not on a bike, but at the side of the road, watching, cataloging, notebook in hand, and it was so accurate that Gideon almost said something about it. And at the center, Eli. Gideon stopped a few feet from the wall and looked at his old friend's face, rendered in paint by Eli's own sister from memory, that was 3 years old but clearly precise. It was accurate in the ways that mattered, not photographic, but true. The particular set of the jaw that meant he was thinking through something he hadn't fully worked out. The angle of the shoulders that was always slightly forward, always moving toward whatever was next. The expression that was simultaneously watching everything and thinking about something else entirely. That specific quality of being entirely present and somehow also somewhere else, which had been the most Eli thing about him. Gideon came to stand beside her. He looked at the painting for a while before he spoke. When did he tell you about us? He asked. She kept looking at the mural. When I was little, 7, 8, He'd take me out on the bike sometimes, just short rides, safe ones, and he'd tell me about the people he rode with. He made you sound like a real person. She almost smiled. Not like a character in a story, like someone with opinions about coffee and bad luck with his left knee. Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Both of those are still accurate. He talked about you more than anyone else, she said. He said you were the one who understood that the club was about something. About what? He was vague about that part, she said. He said when I was older I'd understand it, that some things were too important to explain and had to be lived. They were quiet for a moment. The heater ticked. Outside, a car passed on the gravel road and kept going. Did he talk about the night of the accident? Gideon asked, not leading genuine, wanting to know what Eli had said versus what Gideon himself remembered. No, Sloan said. I only know what the social workers told me, that he was on a solo ride and went down on an on-ramp. Oil slick. She paused. He called me 2 hours before it happened. Gideon turned to look at her. He did. I was at the first foster home then. I wasn't supposed to have a phone, but he'd gotten me one prepaid small. I kept it hidden. He called at 9 in the evening and said, she stopped, breathed. He said he was almost done, that he'd finished what he was working on, and things were going to be different soon. Her jaw was tight. I asked what he meant, and he said I'd find out in a couple weeks. He said he loved me. And then he said he had to go. Gideon was very still. 2 hours later, Sloan said the social worker came into my room. He absorbed that. Eli calling at 9, telling his sister things were almost finished, then going down on that highway. The sequence of it had a shape that Gideon didn't like. He had always believed the accident was an accident. He still believed it. But the timing sat differently in his mind now, next to everything Nora had found next to Raymond Ventry and his decade of patient grievance. He'd finished the custody petition, Gideon said slowly. He must have submitted the final documents that day. He would have felt like it was almost over, like it was going to work. Except it didn't, Sloan said. He didn't know it had already been denied, Gideon said. The timing, he stopped himself. Sloan looked at him. What? Gideon shook his head slowly. Nothing certain, just thinking. She watched him think and didn't push. She had good instincts about when not to push. Gideon walked away slowly, and the moment he was out of her sight line, he found Nora and spoke to her in a low, urgent voice, and she looked at him with an expression that shifted from attention to alarm in the span of his first sentence. If Ventry knew about the custody petition, Nora began, he would have known Eli was about to get her out, Gideon said. And if she got out, if Eli had her, Ventry lost his leverage, his access. You're suggesting the accident. I'm not suggesting anything, Gideon said. I'm saying we need to know. And Adele needs to know if there's anything there worth pursuing. Nora opened her laptop. Cal had been working the Ventry angle steadily, following threads with the patient focus of someone who had grown up with digital research the way Gideon had grown up with paper files. He had assembled a picture that was not complete, but was specific enough to be alarming. Raymond Ventry was 61 years old. He lived in Reno. He ran a private equity operation that specialized in acquiring and operating residential care facilities, group homes, transitional housing, the infrastructure of the welfare system's lower rungs. He had been operating in this space for over a decade. His facilities had mixed records. Some were unremarkable, some had been cited for violations that resulted in minimal fines and continued operation. On paper, he was a businessman who had chosen a specific sector of the service economy. People made money in group home operation. The margins were thin if you were running the facilities correctly, and considerably better if you were cutting corners. His financial disclosures showed a pattern of improved margins in the second year after acquisition, which could mean increased efficiency or could mean something else. And the nature of the regulatory oversight in this sector was such that something else was often what it meant. Cal had dug into the regulatory records. The citations were there minor, usually the kind that regulators issued when they needed to show they were paying attention, but weren't prepared to take significant action. Understaffing, documentation failures. One citation at a facility in Douglas County for inadequate supervision of minors, resulting in a fine and a corrective action plan. The corrective action plan had been submitted and accepted. Whether it had been implemented was not something the records made clear. He had been putting all of this together into a picture that made a kind of business sense when he found the placement history. One of his facilities was in Fairfield County. Cal pulled up the name. Cross-referenced it with Sloan's placement history, which Nora had partially accessed through a sympathetic contact in the county system. The match was exact. The group home Sloan had run from the one where the sketchbook was thrown away, where she'd been worn down until she had no option but to leave, was owned by a management company that traced back through 2 layers of LLC to a holding group in which Raymond Ventry had a controlling interest. Cal sat back from his laptop. He stared at the screen for a long time. He was 26. He had grown up in a stable household, 2 parents, a grandmother nearby, a school that knew his name. He had never been in the foster system and had never had reason to think carefully about how it worked or who profited from it. He thought about it now with the specific screen in front of him, and he felt something that he didn't have a word for, the particular nausea of understanding that a person has been treated as a variable in someone else's equation. A child, a grief-stricken child, who had lost her only family and been placed by a system that was supposed to protect her, placed deliberately in a facility controlled by the man who wanted to use her to settle a score. He thought about Sloan walking in off the street with the electrical tape on her sneaker and the napkin in her inside pocket. He thought about the 6 weeks before that, the bus stations, the fast food bathrooms, the cold nights, the constant motion. All of it engineered, all of it a product of a specific choice by a specific person who had decided that a child's suffering was an acceptable tool. He brought it to Nora. Nora brought it to Gideon. Gideon called Donovan back in from outside. They stood in the back room, all of them now, the whole club assembled without announcement, which had not happened in months. Russ stood near the door. Cal had his laptop open on the desk. Nora stood beside Gideon with the folder in her hands. He put her in his own facility, Donovan said. He said it as if repeating it out loud would help him understand it. He engineered her placement. Through someone in the county system, Nora said. We don't know who yet. And then he pushed her out, Russ said. Made her life there bad enough that she'd run. And then he'd have reason to track her as a runaway. An unstable minor with a history of behavioral issues fleeing care. Much easier to manage than a kid in a stable placement. She didn't run because she was unstable, Cal said. She ran because she was being handled. The room was quiet. Outside, wind moved through the gap under the garage door with a low sound that the crew usually didn't notice, but noticed now. The space heater ticked. Someone's wrench had been left on the edge of a workbench, and it creaked slightly as the metal contracted in the cooling air. I need someone to explain to me, Donovan said slowly, what exactly Ventry wants to happen. Walk me through the endgame. Nora set down the folder. Best case for him, she ends up placed in one of his facilities where the conditions can be controlled. She's isolated. She's difficult to reach legally because she's a ward of the state. She has no family of record, no one in her corner. Whatever happens to her in that environment is manageable, from his perspective. She's a kid, Russ said. She's leverage, Nora said. That's how he's framing it. A way to hurt the Iron Jaws indirectly, the same way he tried to hurt Eli indirectly through the custody petition. He couldn't get to Eli. He can't get to us directly, so he gets to the closest thing. Cal had been quiet for a while. He looked up from his laptop. There's one more thing I found. I didn't want to bring it in until I was sure. Everyone looked at him. He turned the laptop to face the room. On the screen was a map, county records property listings highlighted in a particular area. Ventry has been acquiring facilities in this county specifically for the past 2 years. Not just the one Sloan was placed in. 4 facilities in total, all within 30 miles of Harlow. He's been building something out here. Consolidating. Why here? Donovan asked. Because here is where Eli died, Nora said quietly. And here is where the Iron Jaws are. The room processed that. He's been planning this for 2 years, Gideon said. Not a question. At least, Cal said. Maybe longer. Gideon stood very still. He was looking at the map on Cal's laptop, but he was not really seeing it. He was thinking about the years since Eli's accident, the ordinary years of running the garage and keeping the club legitimate, and occasionally looking at Eli's photograph on the wall and feeling the gap his absence had left, and all of that time somewhere in a Reno office, A man had been patiently building infrastructure toward a revenge that was specifically calibrated to hurt the people Eli had loved. "What's our play?" Russ asked. "We get ahead of it legally," Gideon said. "We build a case before Ventry can file anything. We document everything that shows she's stable here, that she's been cared for, that she's thriving." "And we get a lawyer," Donovan said. "I know someone. Family law handles custody placements. Adele Forsyth. She's sharp and she doesn't waste time." "Call her," Gideon said. 2 days later, the situation changed. Cal was at his laptop near the back when his phone buzzed. A message from a contact, someone who monitored certain databases as a favor, a reciprocal arrangement that Cal had found useful and kept quiet. The message was brief. Ventry's PI filed formal report with NV Child Services, location identified. Expect welfare check within 48 hours. Cal read it twice. He put his phone down. He picked it up again and read it a third time. He thought about the map on his laptop screen, 4 facilities, 30 miles, the infrastructure of a years-long plan finally activating. He thought about the placement in Fairfield County, the engineered departure, the 6 weeks of deliberate tracking. He thought about Sloan at the paint bay 20 feet away, her headphones and adding detail to a client's fender, completely unaware that a clock had just started. He went from sitting to standing without quite remembering the motion. He found Gideon in under a minute. Within the hour, everyone was in the back room again. 48 hours, Donovan said, maybe less. Adele's petition isn't filed yet, Nora said already on her phone. I'm calling her now. Gideon looked at Russ. How much longer does Sloan need on the mural? Russ blinked. The mural, a couple days maybe. Why? Because I want it finished before anyone comes here, Gideon said. I want them to walk in and see it. Russ stared at him. You think a painting is going to change a welfare worker's mind? I think a painting is evidence, Gideon said. Evidence that she's here, that she's working, that she's building something, that she has a place and a purpose and people who see her. He paused. Sometimes the most important things you can show someone aren't documents. They're proof of life. Russ was quiet for a moment. I'll work with her. We'll get it finished. Donovan was already moving toward the door, phone in hand. I'm calling Adele right now. She needs to move tonight. Gideon looked around the room at the faces of the people in it, men he'd ridden with for decades who had stayed when others left, who had built something worth protecting. He thought about Eli Merritt making a phone call at 9 in the evening, telling his sister that things were almost finished. We move tonight, he said. All of it. Everything Nora has compiled, everything Cal found, we get it to Adele, and we get her filed before that welfare check lands. He turned toward the door, then stopped. Sloan was standing in the hallway. She had come looking for Russ to ask about a color she needed, and she had been standing in the hallway long enough. Her expression was completely still, not blank but contained. The kind of stillness that happens after the body has already absorbed the impact and is waiting to understand its dimensions. She looked at Gideon. You knew someone was coming, she said. Gideon didn't lie to her. We found out an hour ago. How long have you known there was someone looking for me? The question was steady, careful, no accusation in it, just precision. A few days, Gideon said. We wanted to understand what we were dealing with before you told me, she said. Yes. She absorbed that. Her jaw was tight. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. Is it just child services? She asked. No, Gideon said. There's someone behind it, someone using the system. Something moved through her expression, not surprise exactly. More like recognition, the confirmation of something she had suspected without evidence, a pattern she'd felt without being able to name. The group home, she said quietly. Gideon nodded. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, the whole weight of what she was processing was visible in the slight downward angle of her shoulders, the way her hands had closed at her sides, without becoming fists controlled, not rigid. She was thinking, calculating the dimensions of what she'd just learned. Then she said, I can disappear again. I've done it before. I'm good at it. I know you are, Gideon said, and I'm asking you not to. I'll bring trouble on all of you. Sloan. His voice was low, direct, not unkind, but not soft. Your brother spent the last 8 months of his life trying to get you out of a system that failed you. He fought the court, and they turned him down because of us, because of this club, because our name was the reason he wasn't good enough. He let that settle. We're not sending you back out there to protect ourselves from the consequences of that. She looked at him. She was searching his face with the particular intensity of someone who had learned not to trust reassurance easily, who had been given reassurance and watched it dissolve too many times to accept it without examination. She found what she was looking for, or enough of it. She uncrossed her arms. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Trust us," Gideon said. "Let us fight this." A long pause. Outside, a car moved slowly down the gravel road, past the garage, and everyone heard it and everyone waited, and then it was gone. "Okay," Sloane said. She turned and walked back toward the paint bay. A moment later, the sound of her working resumed brushstrokes, the small clink of a brush against the rim of a paint can, steady and deliberate. Nobody spoke for a moment. They stood in the hallway listening to the sound of her work, that particular rhythm that had become over the past 2 weeks one of the ambient sounds of the garage. The sound of someone doing what they were built to do in the place they were supposed to be. Gideon thought about Eli. He thought about the phone call 9 in the evening. "Things are almost finished. I love you. I have to go." And about what it must have felt like to be on the other end of that call. To be 11 years old in a room you didn't choose, holding a phone your brother had gotten you in secret, and to hear that it was almost over. To spend 2 hours thinking it was almost over. And then the social worker at the door. He thought about what it took to survive that, and then the years after, and then 6 weeks alone across Nevada, and then to walk into a room full of strangers and say, "I can paint and I'll work for tips," and mean both things and be ready to prove it. He thought about the kind of fiber required for all of that, the specific, unspectacular daily variety of toughness that didn't announce itself and didn't ask for recognition, but was simply there operating, getting the job done. She was 14. She was Eli's sister. She had walked in here because a dead man had pointed her in the right direction, and every step since then had been her own. He was not going to let anyone take that from her. He stood in the hallway for a moment after she disappeared from view, and then he turned to Gideon, and Gideon could see in his face that something had shifted. The calculation was the same, the risk, the exposure, the legal complexity, but the weight of it had changed. It sat differently now that they'd had this conversation in front of her rather than around her. Donovan had 3 children. He had spent the past 2 weeks thinking about this situation, the way he thought about everything that involved risk in terms of what it could cost him, what it could take from the things he'd built, what the downstream consequences would be for people he was actually responsible for. That was not a wrong way to think. It was the way a responsible man thought. But standing in the hallway looking at the space where Sloane had been, he thought about something else instead. He thought about his oldest 17 and just learning to drive, who had once gone through a week of not sleeping because of a situation at school that turned out to be manageable, but that she hadn't felt she could bring to him. He'd found out about it later from his wife, and the thing that had stayed with him, the thing he still turned over sometimes, was not the situation itself but the calculation his daughter had made, the assessment that the problem was too heavy to share, that bringing it to him would be a burden. He thought about Sloane doing that math for 3 years, Eli doing that math for his entire adult life. "I'm calling Adele," Donovan said. "I know," Gideon said. Donovan pulled out his phone and walked outside, and when he came back 20 minutes later, his face was different, resolved in the specific way of a man who has made a decision and stopped arguing with it. "She's in," he said. "She'll be here tomorrow morning at 7. "Good," Gideon said. Donovan looked at the paint bay where Sloane had resumed work on the mural, her back to the room, her headphones and her brush moving. "She's going to be okay," he said, not to anyone in particular. Russ from across the room. "Yeah, she is." That night, Gideon sat in the parking lot again for a long time, watching the lights inside the garage. Through the dirty window, he could see the mural on the far wall and the small figure Sloane had sketched at its edge, the unfinished writer, not yet real, still becoming. He thought about Eli calling his sister at 9 in the evening full of hope. He thought about Raymond Ventry, 61 years old, sitting in Reno, spending money and patience to make a child's life worse. He thought about the specific kind of grief that can become obsession, that can become cruelty, the grief that stops being about the lost person and becomes about the anger instead, and how hard it was to come back from that place once you'd gone in deep enough. He thought about what it would have cost Eli to carry both things, the club and the sister, and how he'd chosen to carry them separately, and how that choice had ultimately been the thing that left her alone. He started the car. He drove home through the empty streets. He did not sleep well, but he slept, and in the morning he was at the garage before Adele arrived, the coffee already made, the documents already organized, ready to do the one thing Eli hadn't been able to do: fight for her and win. Adele Forsyth arrived at the garage at 7 in the morning in a car that had at least 200,000 miles on it, in a briefcase that looked older than most of the bikes inside. She was 54 with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the expression of someone who had been in courtrooms long enough to stop being surprised by anything human beings did to each other. She ordered coffee, black no discussion, and sat at the workbench Nora had cleared and opened the briefcase and started reviewing the documents. She asked questions without looking up from the pages, precise questions that revealed she had already read everything Nora had sent the previous night. She did not perform efficiency. She simply was efficient in the way that people are efficient when they have no patience for the alternative. After 40 minutes, she set the folder down and looked at Sloan directly. "Do you want to stay here?" she asked. Sloan was sitting across from her, hands folded in her lap, her posture the careful stillness of a person who has learned that how you hold yourself in a room full of adults who are deciding things about you matters. "I want to not go back to the group home," Sloan said. Adele's eyes were patient. "That's not what I asked." Sloan met her gaze. She looked at Gideon briefly, then back at Adele. "Yes," she said, "I want to stay." "Then that's what we're working toward," Adele said. She turned to Gideon. "You understand what this requires? Background checks for anyone in direct contact with her. Financial documentation showing the club can provide stable support. Site inspections, probably more than one. The state is going to look for reasons." "Let them look," Gideon said. "I mean that literally," Adele said. "Don't manage what they find. Let them look freely. Any appearance of obstruction ends this." Gideon nodded. "And the Ventry connection," Adele said. "The facility ownership, the investigator, the alleged engineering of her placement, this is significant, but it's also dangerous to overpresent. If we lead with conspiracy and can't prove it to the standard required, we look like we're deflecting." She tapped her pen against the folder. "We present it as context. We let the documented facts speak. The sealed incident report from Eli's custody case, can we get access?" "Working on it," Nora said. "I have a contact at the county clerk's office. It may require a formal motion." "File it today," Adele said. "Whatever's in that report is either going to help us or it's going to hurt us, and I need to know which before we're in front of a judge." She paused. "One more thing." She looked at Sloan. "I'm going to need your sketchbook." Sloan's hands tightened slightly on each other. "The whole thing?" "Yes." A pause. "Okay." Adele looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. She had been doing this for 22 years. She had a fairly reliable instinct for the cases that mattered in ways that transcended the legal and the cases that were just complicated. She had a feeling about this one that she hadn't had in a while. She picked up her briefcase. "I'm filing the emergency petition today. Don't talk to child services without me present. Don't let anyone inside this facility without me present. If Ventry's investigator makes contact, record it and tell me immediately." She looked around the room. "Any questions?" Nobody had questions. She left. The garage felt slightly larger without her in it, or perhaps slightly more uncertain the way a space feels when the person who was holding it together walks out the door. Sloan kept painting. She worked in bursts, sometimes staying up past midnight, headphones and lost in the rhythm of brushstrokes and color. The crew gave her space but stayed close. Someone always made sure there was food. Someone always checked that the heater was running. She didn't ask why they were being so careful. Maybe she sensed it. Maybe she was just used to people keeping secrets around her. The routine of the garage became her routine. She arrived before most of the crew unlocked with the key Gideon had given her on the fourth day, without ceremony or comment, just set it on the workbench in front of her and gone back to his desk. She made coffee in the morning because she discovered on day 2 that the first person in was expected to make coffee, and she was usually the first person in. She swept the paint bay each evening before she stopped for the night because the paint bay was her territory now, and it was an expression of respect for a space to keep it clean. The crew adapted around her the way crews adapt around people who have found their rhythm and their place, not with grand gestures, but with small adjustments. Russ moved his secondary station slightly to give her more room. Cal started leaving extra paper towels near the brushes. Donovan stopped questioning whether the coffee was fresh and started just drinking it. These were not decisions. They were accommodations, natural and gradual, the kind that happened when someone had stopped being a visitor and had become part of the working day. The mural continued to grow. New details appeared each morning, a specific bend in a road that Russ recognized as the highway out past Pyramid Lake, the particular way desert light fell on chrome, a storm building on the horizon in the background that added weight to the composition without announcing itself. Every member of the club was in it now, fully rendered their individual postures and body language accurate in the way that caricature is accurate, slightly amplified, essentially true. Donovan noticed his own figure one morning and stood in front of it for a full minute without speaking. Russ caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "She got the forearms right," Donovan said finally. Russ looked. She had. "She sees things," he said. "Yeah," Donovan said. He walked back to his bench and didn't say anything else about it, but his position on the whole situation had quietly finished shifting, and everyone in the room could feel it. One evening, Gideon found Sloane standing in front of the mural alone after most of the crew had left. She was looking at Eli's face with an expression he recognized, not grief exactly, but the particular texture of missing someone you knew well enough to know how they would have responded to a given moment. You miss them most when something happens that they would have had something to say about. When there's a joke, only they would have caught a detail. Only they would have noticed a silence they would have known exactly how to fill. He came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. He just stood there and looked at what she'd built. The composition had a quality of earned solemnity, not formal or stiff, but weighted the way things are weighted when they've been thought about over a long time by someone who cares. Every figure was specific. Every bike was documented as faithful to memory as the conditions of memory allowed. The road they were on went somewhere, but it curved left at the far edge of the frame and disappeared into a landscape that was unmistakably Nevada, the particular quality of the desert air rendered in paint with an intuition that only came from having grown up in it. "He would have loved this," she said without turning. "Yes," Gideon said. "He would have spent an hour telling you everything wrong with it and then talked about it to everyone he met for the next month." Sloane almost smiled. "That's exactly right. He'd say the flamework was overworked in the middle section, and then he'd show it to every single person who came through the door." They were quiet for a moment. The garage settled around them, the tick of the heater cooling the distant sound of traffic on Route 9. "He told me you were the one who kept the club honest," Sloane said. "He said you were the reason it was worth being part of." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He had heard Eli say similar things in the years when they had ridden together, and it had always made him uncomfortable in the specific way that accurate praise makes you uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because living up to it is a continuous obligation. He was generous. "He wasn't generous," Sloane said. "He was accurate. He didn't say things he didn't mean." She turned to look at him. "Why didn't he tell you about me, really?" Not the protecting me explanation. The real reason. Gideon took a breath. He thought about Eli, not the Eli in the mural or the Eli in the stories, but the actual man. The one who'd been reckless on wet roads and careful with borrowed tools. The one who could talk for 3 hours about color theory and then go completely silent for a week. The one who'd once ridden 400 miles round trip to show up at a hospital when Gideon had been in a minor accident, and who'd sat in the waiting room for 2 hours without being asked, and who'd never mentioned it afterward. "I think he was ashamed," Gideon said carefully. "Not of you, of the situation, of not having gotten you out faster, of having a little sister in the foster system while he was riding free. He carried that." He paused. "Men like Eli, men like most of us, we're better at carrying weight than we are at asking for help with it. He was working on it alone because he thought he should be able to manage it alone, that it was his responsibility, and that bringing it to other people was somehow a failure." Sloane looked back at the mural. "I used to be angry at him for that," she said, "for keeping me secret, for not just asking for help." She was quiet for a moment. "But then I think about being 14 with a dead brother, and I think I understand it. I've done the same thing. I left the group home alone. I traveled alone for 6 weeks. I walked in here alone. I almost left again alone the night Gideon told me someone was coming. Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a long time. "Because he was right. Because I'm tired of calculating the cost of trusting people and coming up with the same answer every time. It gets you through things, but it doesn't get you anywhere. She looked at the unfinished figure at the edge of the mural, her own figure still incomplete, still becoming. I don't know what I look like when I stop running. I've never seen it. You're seeing it now, Gideon said. She turned to look at him with the direct, searching attention she brought to everything she was trying to understand. What if we lose tomorrow? She asked. Then we fight the day after, Gideon said, and the day after that, for as long as it takes. You've never had a child, she said, not an accusation, a fact she was trying to understand. No, he said. So why does this matter so much to you? He thought about it honestly the way the question deserved. Because Eli mattered to me, he said, and because you're here and you're real and you're capable of extraordinary things, and there's a man spending money to make sure none of those things get a chance to happen. And because, he stopped, because I'm 63 years old and I've spent most of my life being very good at the things that I'm good at and not particularly interested in anything else. And then you walked in here with a napkin drawing and I recognized a dead man's hand and I thought, here's something I can still do that matters. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the mural. Gideon looked at his old friend's painted face, fierce and alive, leading the way. Not looking back, and felt for the first time since the accident, something that was not just absence. Something that was presence. The understanding that the connection hadn't ended, it had changed shape. You don't have to do that here, he said. Carry it alone. She nodded slowly. She picked up her brush and added a stroke to the mural. A small one, precise something in the background that she'd been thinking about for days. Gideon watched her work for a while, then quietly walked away. He left the lights on behind him. The welfare check arrived on the second day after Adele's filing, not 48 hours 31, which meant either their timeline estimate had been wrong or Ventry had pushed things forward. Nora believed it was the latter. She had been watching the public filing database all morning and had seen an activity that suggested someone with access to the system was accelerating the process. Cal got the notification at 10 in the morning. A standard welfare check filed through the county office, 2 caseworkers assigned. He called Nora immediately. Nora called Adele. Adele arrived at the garage 17 minutes later in her battered car briefcase on her arm, already making notes on a yellow legal pad as she walked through the door. Who are they sending? She asked. Patterson and someone named Greer, Nora said. Patterson I've seen in records before standard caseworker, no obvious affiliations. Greer is senior, supervisory level. Greer, Adele repeated. She wrote the name down. Something in the way she wrote it suggested the name was not entirely new to her. When do they arrive? 2 hours. All right. Adele set down the legal pad. Here's how this works. You open everything. You answer every question fully and without hesitation. If I think a question is inappropriate, I'll tell you, otherwise you answer it. You do not interpret, you do not editorialize, you answer precisely what's asked. Sloane, she looked at the girl who was standing near the paint bay watching Haw. Same applies to you. Be precise. Be calm. If you don't understand a question, say so and ask for clarification. Don't fill silence with extra information. Sloane nodded. She'd been quiet since Nora had told her the check was coming, that quiet that Gideon had come to recognize as her processing mode, absorbing, calculating, deciding how to carry the next thing. Russ, Adele said, turning, is the camera operational? Russ had installed the camera 3 days ago after the meeting where they'd discussed Ventry's pattern of using proxies. He'd mounted it near the paint station, angled to cover the main work area and the approach to the back wall where Sloane kept her things. He'd done it quietly without announcement because he had a particular instinct for the ways people tried to control outcomes when they thought no one was watching, and he'd wanted to be wrong about this one. Operational, he said, recording to the server continuously. I've got remote access from my phone. Good, Adele looked at Gideon. Remember, open the building. Show them everything. Do not manage what they see. There were 2 of them. Patterson arrived first, mid-30s, neutral expression, professional clipboard, the manner of someone doing a job they'd done 1,000 times. He shook hands without warmth or coldness, just procedure. Greer came in behind him, older, quieter, with a stillness that Gideon clocked within 30 seconds. It was the stillness of a man who was paying attention to things that weren't the official subject of his attention. His eyes moved to Sloane before they moved to anything else. Donovan watched Greer watching Sloane and felt the cold, clean anger that he'd learned over the years to hold very still. He crossed his arms and leaned against the far wall and did not move from that position for the duration. The inspection proceeded. Patterson was systematic. He went through his checklist with the thoroughness of a man who understood that documentation was protection for everyone, including the subject. He asked about sleeping arrangements, meals, supervision, schedules, school plans. He asked Sloan his questions in a neutral tone and wrote down her answers with the same neutrality. He was as far as Gideon could read, doing exactly what his job description said. Greer operated differently. He moved through the space in the way that certain people move through spaces, ostensibly casual, actually purposeful. His hands always near things without quite touching them. He opened the door to the back office. He examined the workbenches. He looked at the mural on the far wall for a moment. Something passed through his expression that he controlled before it fully formed, and then he moved on. He came to the area near Sloane's things. Her backpack was on its hook, the outer pocket unzipped slightly from that morning when she'd gotten out a pencil. Greer's body shifted. His hands were briefly out of Patterson's sightline. Patterson was across the room, clipboard in hand, asking Sloan about school enrollment options. Russ at his secondary bench had his phone in his hand. He watched the monitor. He watched Greer's hands. He did not say anything. He let it happen. He documented every second of it. The inspection concluded 20 minutes later. Patterson made his final notes and said the standard things: further review, required contact within 24 hours. Thank you for your cooperation. He was professional throughout. Greer said the situation required further review and that they would be in contact within 24 hours about next steps. He said it in the tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than a process update. He looked at Sloan once more before he left. Adele held the door. She watched both men reach their car. She watched the car pull out of the parking lot and onto Route 9. She watched until it was out of sight. Then she turned around. 20 seconds after the door closed, Russ said, "Gideon." Gideon came over. Russ turned the monitor toward him and played back the footage. They watched Greer's hands. They watched the angle of his body. They watched the small, practiced motion near the backpack, fast, smooth, the kind of motion that was invisible unless you were watching the right angle, which Russ had made sure to watch. Gideon looked at Adele. "Let me see the backpack," Adele said quietly. Cal went to retrieve it without explanation. Adele checked the outer pocket, the pocket that Sloan used only for pencils and paint rags, the pocket that had been slightly open. Inside, among the pencils wrapped in a small cloth, a folding knife. 3 inches locking blade, no markings. Not Sloan's. Sloan had never owned a knife. She had traveled for 6 weeks with nothing that could be construed as a weapon because she understood implicitly that the version of her that the system would see needed to be uncomplicated. Clean file, nothing to annotate. She knew what a single annotation could do to a person's options. In the system she'd read her own file, she knew the damage a single caseworker's characterization could do. Adele looked at the knife for a long moment. She did not touch it further after the initial discovery. She was already thinking about evidence change documentation, what the footage established, and what it would need to establish in a legal context. She looked at Gideon. They were going to file this as grounds for removal, she said. Minor in possession of a dangerous weapon in an environment containing tools and motorcycles and adult males. They'd have had an emergency placement order in their hands by tonight. Possibly an emergency hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. We would have been responding at the worst possible moment with no time to prepare. The room was quiet. Sloan was looking at the knife from across the room. Her expression was not shock. It was the specific expression of someone who had suspected something was possible, had chosen to hope it wasn't, and had now received confirmation. The exhaustion of being right about a bad thing. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at Gideon. "How much trouble is this?" she asked. "None," Adele said, "because we have 40 seconds of footage that shows exactly where it came from." She looked at Gideon. "Preserve that recording, multiple copies, different locations, tonight." "Already on it," Russ said. He had his phone in his hand. "Copying to the server to my personal drive, and I'll send a copy to Nora." "Good." Adele put the knife in an evidence bag she produced from her briefcase. She had come prepared for various possibilities because she was Adele Forsyth, and preparation was not optional. "This changes our position significantly. We were petitioners with a sympathetic case. Now we're petitioners with a sympathetic case and evidence of deliberate misconduct by a county supervisor. She picked up her legal pad. I need to make some calls. She stepped outside and the sound of her voice on the phone was audible through the window. For a long time, Chris specific moving through the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. The morning of the hearing, the garage smelled of coffee and something Donovan had insisted on making eggs, bacon, toast, an actual breakfast set out on the cleared workbench like a proper meal. He'd arrived at 5:30 to do it and hadn't said a word about why, and nobody had asked. He stood at the small camp stove he'd brought from home and made breakfast with the quiet focus of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do at a given moment is a specific, concrete thing. The eggs were scrambled. The bacon he'd gotten right. The toast he'd slightly burned on one side and left that side down. Cal arrived at 6 and looked at the food and looked at Donovan and said nothing because he was 26 and perceptive enough to understand what the breakfast was about and wise enough not to name it. Sloan was already awake when they arrived. She'd been awake since before 5. Nobody asked what she'd been doing, but when Gideon checked the paint bay at 5:15, the mural had 2 new additions, small careful details in the background, a bird on a wire in the upper right corner, and in the storm building on the horizon, which had been a solid dark mass before small breaks in the clouds through which light was coming. He stood in front of it for a minute alone in the quiet garage and felt the particular pressure of a moment that will be remembered regardless of how it ends. She ate without speaking. She was dressed differently than usual, the same jeans, cleaner ones, and a dark blue shirt under the olive jacket. Her hair was down, which Gideon had not seen before. It was longer than her ponytail had suggested, falling past her shoulders, and with it down, she looked both younger and more formidable at once, which was a combination he wouldn't have been able to explain, but that he recognized as accurate. Donovan sat across from her at the workbench and ate his own breakfast, and they didn't talk, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the first morning when he'd handed her a coffee and asked if anyone was looking for her. That silence had been the silence of 2 strangers measuring distance. This one was the silence of people who had decided something and were living in the aftermath of the decision. The distance had been crossed. There was nothing to measure anymore. When they were done, Donovan cleared the plates. He looked at Sloan. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "Good answer," he said. "Let's go." Russ caught Donovan's eye across the room as they were getting ready to leave. He gave him a brief nod, the kind of nod that carried specific weight between people who'd known each other a long time. Donovan returned it. Adele met them at the courthouse entrance. She looked them over, Gideon, Donovan, Nora, Cal, Sloan, with the appraising eye of someone confirming that the team she'd briefed was the team that had shown up. "Anything I should know before we go in?" she asked. "No," Gideon said. She looked at Sloan. "How are you doing?" "I'm here," Sloan said. Adele almost smiled. "That's enough," she said. "Let's go." The courtroom was small and functional, the way county courtrooms tend to be, when they're handling the unspectacular category of human lives, the ones that aren't newsworthy, but are nonetheless catastrophic to the people inside them. The ceiling was too low and the light was fluorescent, and the wood of the benches had the worn, slightly gummy quality of decades of anxious hands. Sloan sat in the front row between Gideon and Nora. She kept her backpack on her lap, both hands resting on it, not clutching, just present. She looked at the room with the same cataloging attention she'd had when she first walked into the garage, and Gideon watched her do it and thought, Eli's eyes, that's Eli's eyes. The state was represented by a young attorney named Corbin, who had the bearing of someone who had been told this was a straightforward case and had prepared accordingly. He had a clean stack of documents and the confident posture of a man who expected the morning to go in a predictable direction. Adele noticed the confidence and made a small note on her legal pad. Raymond Ventry arrived 3 minutes before the hearing began. He came in quietly through the back and took a seat at the far end of the public gallery. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, gray-haired, with the particular stillness of a man who had waited a long time for a thing and was now in the room where it would either happen or not happen. He did not look at Gideon when he entered. He looked only at Sloan. Sloan felt it. She turned slightly, found him, and held his gaze for a 3-second count, long enough to be deliberate, brief enough to be controlled, and then she turned back to face the bench. Gideon noted it and noted also that her hands had not tightened on the backpack. The clarity he'd seen in her at the courthouse steps had not left her. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Harwell. She had the manner of someone who had heard a great many stories and had developed opinions about the difference between stories that were true and stories that were constructed to be true, and who considered the ability to tell the difference to be the most important thing she did. Adong had arranged the presentation with the architecture of someone building a structure foundation, first then walls, then roof. She did not begin with Ventry, she began with Sloan. She established the basic timeline: Eli Merritt's accident, the foster placements, the group home, the departure. She submitted documentation of conditions at the group home, incident reports compiled from multiple former residents, a pattern of complaints filed and not acted on state citations that resulted in fines and continued operation. She showed the system's own records against itself. Corbin objected to the relevance of the broader pattern. Adele produced 3 specific incidents involving current residents that had occurred within the past 18 months. Corbin stopped objecting. Then she presented Eli's custody petition. The filing, the denial, the stated reason: association with Ironjaw's MC creates unsuitable home environment. She read the specific language aloud without editorial and let it sit in the room. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished reading. Even Corbin was quiet. Judge Harwell made a note. She put Donovan on the stand. He spoke about his own 3 children, their names, their ages, the specific things they taught him about what it meant to be responsible for a young person's life. He spoke about watching Sloan arrive with a worn backpack and a piece of paper she handled like it was precious, and about watching her work for weeks in the garage with the focused intensity of someone who had found the one thing that made sense. He was not eloquent. He was specific, and specific was better. He spoke about why he'd had reservations. He said it plainly that he had 3 kids of his own and a business he'd built, and that he had been afraid of what getting involved would cost. He said he'd been wrong to frame it that way, and that he'd understood he was wrong on the morning he made breakfast at 5:30, because it was the only useful thing he could think to do. He said that when Sloan had asked if she should disappear again, and Gideon had said no, and she had said, okay, the specific texture of that, okay, the weight of trust it carried had been the moment he'd stopped calculating and started just doing the work. Corbin cross-examined him. Donovan answered every question directly and without elaboration, and the cross-examination concluded without having done the damage Corbin had hoped for. Judge Harwell listened to him carefully. When Donovan stepped down, she made another note. Her face gave nothing away, but she was writing more than she usually wrote. Then Adele put Gideon on the stand. The state's attorney objected to the characterization of Gideon as a guardian figure on the grounds of the club's historical associations, and Adele let him make the argument fully, and then she presented the specific record, the years of legitimate operation, the business filings, the tax documentation, the absence of criminal charges for any member currently associated with the club. She presented financial documentation showing that Gideon Marsh could provide stable housing and support for a minor. She presented character statements from 3 business owners in Harlow who had known the club for a decade or more. Gideon was on the stand for 40 minutes. He spoke about Eli, not about the accident or the steel chains, just about the man. Who he was, what he cared about, how he rode and worked and told stories and made everyone around him feel like the room was more interesting than it had been before he walked in. He spoke about the particular quality of Eli's loyalty, the way it was absolute and quiet, the way it expressed itself in action rather than declaration. He spoke about the day he'd held a napkin drawing and recognized a dead man's hand, and about the feeling of understanding in that moment that Eli had been carrying something alone that he should have been allowed to share. Corbin's cross-examination pushed on the club's past. Gideon answered every question directly. Yes, the club had operated in gray areas in its early years. Yes, there had been incidents. Yes, his own record showed a charge from 17 years ago that had resulted in a fine in community service. He stated each fact plainly without defensiveness, and then he returned to the present, what the club was now, what it had been for 15 years, and what it was capable of being for one 14-year-old girl who had no one else. Judge Harwell listened. When Gideon stepped down, the room felt different, not dramatically, but in the way that a room feels different when a thing has been stated clearly enough that everyone present understands it. The footage of Greer planting the knife came in as an exhibit. The state's attorney tried to dispute the chain of evidence, argued the camera had not been disclosed. argued the interpretation of what the footage showed was ambiguous. Adele had prepared for both objections. She had the technical documentation required, and she also had a statement from a former employee of the Fairfield County Group Home who had been contacted by Nora 3 days earlier, a woman named Louise Archer who had left the facility 6 months ago and who had, in a recorded phone call, described specific instructions she'd received regarding the management of certain residents' personal property and the specific circumstances under which those instructions had been given. The statement named a supervisor. The supervisor's employment records, which Nora had obtained through a formal records request, showed a connection to the management company that Ventry controlled. The state's attorney was no longer pursuing the knife angle by the time Adele finished with the exhibit. Judge Harwell called a brief recess. During the recess, Sloan sat in the hallway with Gideon. She had her backpack on her lap, both arms around it, not hunched but held. The way you hold something you cannot put down. The hallway had the institutional quiet of courthouses, HVAC, hum, hard floors, a clerk passing with a folder, the distant sound of someone's phone vibrating somewhere down the corridor. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon for everyone except the people sitting on these benches. "You okay?" Gideon asked. "I keep thinking about him being here," she said. She meant Ventry. He was in the courtroom, seated in the public gallery, and Sloan had seen him when they walked in. She had recognized him from the photograph Cal had found, a tall man, gray-haired, with the specific stillness of a person who was accustomed to waiting for outcomes rather than creating them. When their eyes had met briefly accidentally in the crowded space of the gallery, Sloan had felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear? Something closer to clarity. The understanding that the thing that had been hunting her had a face, and that the face was just a man's face, tired around the eyes, carrying something old and heavy, the weight of a grief that had been redirected into purpose for so long that the grief itself had been almost entirely consumed by it. "He's been behind all of it," she said. "The group home, the investigator, the knife." "Yes," Gideon said, "because of Eli. Because he thinks Eli killed his brother." "He thinks it," Gideon said. "It isn't true." Sloan was quiet for a moment. "I know. I knew Eli. He didn't have that in him." She paused. "I think Ventry knows it too somewhere. I think he just needed it to be true because the alternative that his brother died by accident, that it meant nothing, that it was just rain on a highway and bad timing, that's the harder thing to live with. You can fight a cause. You can't fight an accident." She shifted the backpack. "It doesn't make what he did okay. I just understand it well enough that I don't have to be afraid of it." Gideon looked at her, the arithmetic of her again. 14 years old. "What happens if the judge rules against us?" she asked. "Then we appeal," Gideon said, "and we keep appealing. And we use every legal mechanism available until we find the one that works. And in the meantime, I go back into the system." "In the meantime," Gideon said carefully, "you are not alone. There is a legal case actively in process. There are people who know your name and are watching and will not stop watching." He paused. "But I don't think it comes to that." She nodded, then as she said quietly, "Eli was right about you." Gideon didn't say anything. He looked at the floor and then at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the missing joint, the hands that had held a napkin drawing and shaken, and then at the courtroom door. They were called back in. Adele called Sloan. Judge Harwell asked her the questions she had been prepared for, and Sloan answered them. How long she had been at the garage, what she did there, whether she felt safe. She answered carefully without performance. She talked about the work, about what it meant to paint in a style that her brother had taught her, about the specific texture of waking up each morning in a place where someone had left the heater running and there was coffee on the burner, and the ambient sound was the sound of people working on things they cared about. She talked about the difference between that and the group home, and she did it without bitterness. She described both things accurately, and the contrast established itself without needing to be named. She talked about the mural. She described it not technically but essentially. Why she had started it, what she was trying to show. All of them, past and present, on a road together. Her brother at the center of it, because that was where he was. And behind him, a figure she was still working on. "Who is that figure?" Judge Harwell asked. Sloan paused. The room was quiet. She could feel Ventry somewhere behind her. "Me," she said. "I haven't finished her yet because I don't know yet what she looks like when she stops running. I've been trying to figure it out." She paused. I think I'm closer now than I was 2 weeks ago. Judge Harwell looked at her for a moment. Then she asked, "Is there anything you'd like me to understand that I haven't asked you about?" Sloane's hands, which had been folded in her lap, moved. She reached into the backpack and took out the sketchbook. She had carried it for 3 years. Through 6 foster placements and a bus station in Barstow, and 3 weeks of sleeping in places that were not beds. She had protected it from the group home, retrieved it from a dumpster at midnight, kept it hidden in every place she'd stayed under, mattresses in the lining of the olive jacket, tucked inside a second shirt in the bottom of the backpack. It was swollen from humidity and used the cover worn soft as cloth, the spine reinforced with tape she'd applied so carefully that the tape had become part of the cover itself. She stood and carried it to the bench. "He gave me this 2 Christmases before he died," she said. "He used it to teach me. Every technique he knew, he wrote it in here. Everything he wanted me to understand about painting and about looking at things and about seeing what's actually there instead of what you expect to see. He said that was the whole work, not just painting and everything. Learning to see correctly." She stopped. "He made it for me. Notes he wrote knowing I would read them. Not just technique him, what he thought about, who he was trying to be. It's the only thing I have left of him that is completely his." She set it on the bench. The last entry he wrote was the week before his accident, a note about color theory. He didn't know it was the last one, he was just continuing the work. But on the back of that page, the judge turned to it. The drawing was small, less detailed than Sloane's usual work, more like a note than a finished piece. A man and a small girl rendered in simple lines standing in front of a motorcycle. The man's hand was on the girl's shoulder. Behind them, barely sketched, a familiar emblem, the iron jawbone, the coiled serpent. Below the drawing in handwriting that Gideon recognized from the club's old records, the same hand that had signed work orders, written margin notes on technique, files, and drawn the particular flourish on those 2 initials. 3 lines: "If you ever need them, find them. Iron Jaws Harlow. Their family. They will know what to do. I love you." The room did not make a sound. Judge Harwell looked at the page for a long time, long enough that everyone in the room understood she was not performing consideration. She was actually somewhere internal, turning over what she was looking at and what it meant. A dead man's handwriting, a child who had carried it for 3 years across Nevada desert because it was the only direction she had. A circle completed in a small county courtroom on a Tuesday in October. Corbin at his table was very still. He had prepared for many things. He had not prepared for this. Raymond Ventry was sitting in the gallery. He had been still throughout the hearing, impassive, the stillness of a patient man who had learned to wait. But Gideon was watching him, and in the moment after the judge's silence extended past a certain point, something changed in Ventry's expression. Something that had been held tightly for a very long time, 10 years. The specific hardness of a grief converted entirely into purpose began very slightly to release. It was not defeat. It was the recognition of defeat, which was a different thing and in some ways more final. Because defeat was something you could argue with appeal, overcome. The recognition of defeat was the end of the argument. The moment when you understood that the thing you'd been fighting had already happened and that it had been larger than you, and that the space your brother left was going to stay empty regardless of what you did next. Judge Harwell closed the sketchbook. She returned it to Sloane. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench and looked at the room with the measured attention of a person who understood the weight of what she was about to say. "I've reviewed the documentation presented by both parties," she said. Her voice was even calibrated, the voice of a person who had learned that clarity was a form of kindness. "I've heard testimony, and I've seen evidence, some documented, some less easily documented, of a child who has been failed by multiple institutions in sequence, and of a group of people who are attempting imperfectly but genuinely to provide what those institutions did not." She paused. "The Iron Jaws Motorcycle Club has a history. It also has a present, and the present is what is relevant to this determination." She set down her pen. "I am granting temporary guardianship to Gideon Marsh with the support structure of the Iron Jaws Collective under supervised conditions. There will be quarterly check-ins conducted by the court with full cooperation expected from all parties. There will be educational enrollment confirmed within 30 days. There will be a formal review at 6 months, at which point this arrangement will be assessed for continuation." Sloane exhaled. Slowly, the way you exhale when you have been holding air for a very long time and hadn't fully understood how long. The sound of it was barely audible, but Gideon heard it. Any violations of these conditions, Judge Harwell continued, and this arrangement is subject to immediate review. I want to be clear that this is not a categorical statement about the club's general suitability as a guardian environment. This is a decision about this child in these specific circumstances based on what I have seen today. She looked at Gideon. Don't give me cause to revisit it. We won't, Gideon said. Outside the courthouse, the Nevada afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of sky that looked clean from being empty. A hawk was circling somewhere above the parking lot riding a thermal, and Sloane stood on the steps watching it for a moment before she came down. Adele shook Gideon's hand on the steps, brisk and firm. Quarterly reviews, she said. Treat them seriously, not as obstacles, as opportunities to demonstrate. We will, Gideon said. The Ventry situation isn't over, she said, lowering her voice slightly. The footage, the planted knife, the facility connection, the Louise Archer statement, there may be additional action possible, both civil and through the County Oversight Board. Greer's employment situation is going to become someone's problem very soon. I intend to make sure it becomes the right person's problem. She paused. I'm not done with it. Neither are we, Nora said. Adele nodded once. She looked at Sloane, really looked at her in the direct way she'd been doing since the first morning at the garage, the look of a person who was cataloging what she saw and would remember it accurately. You did well in there, she said. Sloane met her eyes. Thank you for fighting for me. Adele picked up her briefcase. That's what I do, she said, without sentiment but not without warmth. And she walked down the steps toward her battered car, and Gideon watched her go and felt the specific gratitude you feel toward a person who fights for you without pretending it's easy or comfortable, or something they do for reasons other than that it needs to be done. Some people are built for exactly one thing, and they do that thing with a completeness that is its own kind of grace. Adele Forsyth was built for this. He turned. Donovan was beside him, and Russ had come directly from the garage and was standing at the bottom of the steps, still in his work jacket, his boots dusty. Cal and Nora were there, and Sloane standing slightly apart, her backpack on one shoulder, looking at the courthouse building as if she was waiting to see if it was going to take something back. It didn't. Gideon was aware peripherally of movement at the base of the courthouse steps. Raymond Ventry walking out, his attorney beside him, speaking quietly. They moved toward a car parked along the street. Ventry's pace was unhurried, controlled the walk of a man who had not broken, would perhaps never fully break, but had been stopped. There was a difference between those things, and Gideon understood it. He passed within 15 feet of where Gideon stood. He stopped. It was not planned. It was the brief, involuntary pause of a man who has carried something for a long time and finds himself unexpectedly in the physical proximity of the person who represents the end of carrying it. The place where you either put the weight down or carry it forever. He looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and both of them understood that. Ventry had spent a decade trying to transfer the weight of his brother's death onto people who had not caused it. He had failed. The weight was still his, and it would remain his, and whether he could ever set it down was a question only he could answer. Gideon could not answer it for him. He could only stand here steady and let the moment complete itself. Ventry's eyes moved. Not to Gideon, past him to Sloane, who was standing several feet back and slightly to the side watching. Something happened in Ventry's face, then something that was not the calculated stillness he'd maintained throughout the hearing, but something more involuntary. He looked at her for 1 second, 2, and then looked away. He turned and walked to the car, and the attorney followed, and the doors closed, and the car pulled away down the street. Gideon stood and watched it go until it turned at the corner and was gone. Donovan came to stand beside him. Is it done? He asked. The legal part has started, Gideon said. The rest takes time. Donovan nodded slowly. He's going to have to live with himself either way. Yes, Gideon said, he is. Donovan looked at Sloane. She was watching the street where the car had gone, her expression careful, thoughtful, not angry, not afraid. Working something out. Then she turned back to the group, and the expression shifted, became something more present, more here. She looked at all of them on the courthouse steps in the late Nevada afternoon, The crew from the garage standing in the cold air outside a building that had just changed something about her life. And she looked at Gideon, and she said nothing, but something in the way she was standing was different from before. She had stopped calculating the exits. They drove back to Harlow in a loose convoy, 3 bikes and 2 cars, and when they pulled into the Iron Jaws parking lot, the afternoon was fading toward early evening, and the garage windows were lit from inside. The lights were on. Something warm-smelling drifted out through the gap under the door. Russ, who had left the courthouse ahead of the others, had beaten them back. He'd started something heating on the camp stove and then left it and gone to stand in front of the mural. He was still standing there when they came through the door, his hands at his sides, looking at the far wall with an expression that Gideon had never seen on him before. Not his working expression, not the focused proprietary look of a painter examining his own craft or someone else's. Something quieter, something that was simply looking. Sloane stopped when she saw what he had done. In her absence in the 3 hours since she'd been at the courthouse, he had worked on the figure at the edge of the composition. The small rider, the one she'd sketched in pencil and left unfinished because she hadn't known how to finish it. The one that had been barely present, made of light lines and intention, and the open question of what she looked like on the other side of running. He had not changed what she'd established. He had developed it carefully in her style, studying the work she'd done on every other figure in the piece, and learning the language she'd been building for 3 years and speaking it as faithfully as he could. He'd mixed the colors from what she'd left at her station, matched them by eye, with the patience of a man who had been doing that specific thing for 19 years. He'd worked slowly and precisely, and he had gotten it right in the ways that mattered, and where he'd gotten it slightly wrong. He had been wrong in a direction that was respectful of what she'd started. The figure was fully rendered now. A girl on a motorcycle, not a bike of light pencil lines, but a real machine, solid and specific, detailed in the way Sloane detailed everything she cared about. The girl's body was leaned forward into the wind with the posture of someone going somewhere on purpose. She was at the edge of the frame, just behind Eli, and the composition positioned her not as a follower, but as a rider who had found her own line and was holding it. The whole mural breathed now in a way it hadn't before. The composition had been almost complete for days, every other figure, present the road defined the light and weather fully realized. But the unfinished rider had been a gap that the eye kept finding a place where the painting held its breath. Now it exhaled. The thing was whole. Sloane stood in front of it for a long time. She moved her eyes from figure to figure, Russ, Donovan, Cal, Nora, Gideon, and the others she'd added across the weeks, and then to Eli at the center. Eli exactly as she had remembered him. Eli fierce and alive, and leading them all into a light that the painting made you feel rather than see. And then to herself behind him, fully present, fully rendered, on the road. She looked at that figure for a longer time the way you look at something that has shown you something true about yourself. Not comfortable, not easy, true. Russ stood a few feet back, watching her look at it. He had done what he thought needed doing, and now he was waiting to find out if he'd been right. He was not usually wrong about things involving paint, but this had not been a question about paint. It had been a question about something harder to calibrate, and he had trusted his instinct, and now he waited. Sloane turned to look at him. "You got the lean right," she said. Her voice was quiet. "That's exactly how Eli rode. Forward like the bike wasn't fast enough and never would be." Russ let out a breath. "I had a lot of reference material." She looked at the mural for another long moment. Something was passing through her face, a kind of private accounting, the summing of things too numerous and particular to name. And then she turned to face the room. All of them were there, the whole crew standing in the warm light of the garage that smelled of oil and paint, and something heating on the stove, watching her. Waiting. Gideon stepped forward. He was holding something she hadn't noticed in his hand, a small piece of fabric folded, carefully held, like something that had been thought about for a while. He held it out to her. It was a patch. Custom-made, the stitching new and clean, done in the club style but different in its specifics. The Iron Jaws emblem rendered in the familiar design, but beneath it a smaller motif, a brush in front of a flame, precise and deliberate. Below that, 2 letters stitched in thread, the color of copper, SM. "It's not a membership patch," Gideon said. His voice was steady but only just. "You're 14 and we're a motorcycle club. There are limits." The corner of his mouth moved. "But it's yours, and it means what it means." Sloane took it in both hands. She turned it over, feeling the stitching with her fingertips, the raised letters, the small brush, the flame beneath that looked like it was moving. She thought about the napkin in her inside pocket, the one Eli had drawn, the one she'd carried all this way, the one that had gotten her through a door she hadn't been sure would open. She thought about the sketchbook now in her bag and the last page with its 3 lines. She thought about what it meant that a dead man could still be so specifically right about something years after he was gone. She looked at the mural, at Eli, at the girl beside him with her own line and her own speed and the open road ahead. She looked at Gideon and at Russ, who had spent 3 hours quietly doing something difficult because it needed to be done, and he could do it, and there was no more complicated reason than that. At Donovan, who had made breakfast at 5:30 in the morning because it was the only useful thing he could think to do, and who had stood up in a courtroom and said plainly that he'd been wrong in his calculations and then explained what had corrected him. At Nora, who had sat in a back office with bad coffee and asked questions that felt like conversation until the answers came freely. At Cal, who had followed threads through old databases for days until he found the one that changed everything. She looked at the patch in her hands. For the first time since she had walked into this garage with a worn backpack and a folded napkin and one piece of information a dead man had given her, for the first time and longer than she could clearly remember, the careful, controlled expression that she maintained to keep herself safe was not there. What was there instead was her actual face, the one that existed underneath the management and the calculation and the practiced stillness, the face that came when the situation no longer required protection. She smiled. Not the performance of okayness she'd deployed in 100 different rooms in front of 100 different adults who needed her to be manageable. Not the focused expression she wore when she was working. Not the controlled stillness she maintained when she was being watched. A real smile. The kind that arrives before you've decided to allow it. The kind that means something has changed at a depth that expressions can't usually reach. Thank you, she said, not to any one of them. To the room. To the thing the room was and had been and was going to keep being. Gideon put a hand briefly on her shoulder. His scarred, steady hand, the one with the missing joint, the one that had held Eli's napkin drawing and shaken 36 days ago. And then he turned toward the stove to check on what was heating, because some things needed to continue, and eating was one of them, and the work of being a family was in the continuation as much as in the moments that named it. It was in the doing of ordinary things in the same space consistently over time. It was in the making of breakfast and the checking of heaters and the staying when the calculation said leave. Donovan moved toward the table. He got out plates without being asked and set them in the right number and in the right places because he had 3 children and he knew what a table was for. Cal started helping. Nora poured coffee into the cups she'd come to know were each person's Gideon's. The large dark one, Russ's with the chip on the handle, the plain white one she'd set out for Sloan that first morning, and that had become hers. Russ looked at the mural one more time and then went to help with the food because the painting was finished and the food was real, and both things mattered. Sloan sat at the workbench that had become hers. She set the patch down in front of her. She looked at it once more. Then she picked it up and tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, the pocket where she kept the napkin, the pocket for things she didn't want to lose, and she sat and waited for the food and listened to the sound of the garage settling into evening. Outside, the Nevada dark was coming in from the east the way it always did, fast and complete the desert, giving up its heat to the sky in minutes once the sun was gone. Route 9 ran past the garage and into the distance, where the asphalt gave way to gravel, and the streetlights stopped pretending to work, and the road continued anyway into the open dark the way roads do. It did not require anyone to ride it. It did not ask anything. It was simply there as it had been there when Eli rode it, and as it would be there after all of them were gone, patient and indifferent and absolutely available to anyone with the will to take it. Inside the Iron Jaws garage, the lights were on. The mural was finished. The heater was running. Something good was on the stove. And a girl who had been running for 6 weeks, running in a real sense for 3 years, running since the morning a social worker came to her room and changed the shape of everything, that girl was standing still. She was standing still and holding something that was hers in a room full of people who had decided she was theirs not by blood, not by law, yet but by the specific, irreversible choice of people who had been given the option to walk away and had stayed instead, and the road outside could wait. It would still be there tomorrow. And tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, She would choose when to ride it. She would choose the direction and the speed and how far she went and when she came back. She would choose all of it. That was the whole thing. That was what it meant.